This is One on One. Sheri Fink is the author of 5 Days at Memorial. Good to see you.
Nice to see you, too.
Let me set this up. We're talking about Memorial Medical Center in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. An incredible story. For 5 days after Hurricane Katrina, the staff there, along with 250 patients, were trapped. Mm-hmm. No power?
They lost power. Yes, they lost power.
And so as this story goes,
mm-hmm.
and some of us who, from a distance, we experienced Hurricane Sandy, we try to imagine, I mean, that was horrific, trying to imagine Katrina. As the story goes, very quickly it becomes clear that incredibly difficult moral and ethical decisions have to be made because you have 250 people there. The helicopters are coming down and they're getting them one or two at a time.
Right. And
they have to decide who gets to go and who doesn't and pick it up.
Yes. So you think about just the wide range of patients you would have in a hospital. You have the little tiny ICU babies who might be very fragile. They rely on power for their care. You have the very elderly patients who also have similar concerns. Then you might have younger patients who might have a better life expectancy. So all of these pregnant women. So some people say, ethically speaking, that might be two people. So there are lots of different ways to look at this. Do you save the young because they have a lot of life ahead of them? Do you save the elders because they're wise
Who's
and
making the calls?
Contributed to society?
Who's making these decisions?
So now we think about this in advance, but at that time it was just ad hoc, group of doctors, they're natural leaders. They got together and they quickly made this choice. And they wrote 1, 2, and 3 on pieces of paper or on the patient's gowns, put them on the patients. 1s were the relatively healthy, 2s were somewhat more sick, 3s were the very ill or do not resuscitate, and they actually put the 3s to go last. I asked them why this was. One of them said, well, I figured if somebody was closer to the end of life, they would have the least to lose compared with other people who might, have longer. Another person said, well, if a person chose a do not resuscitate, I figured they wouldn't want extraordinary measures to rescue them in normal times. So he sort of kind of by implication thought that that would be what the person would want, not to be saved at the expense of others in a disaster. But of course, there's nothing in a do not resuscitate order that indicates this. So of course, you had families who were confused about what was the order, right, begging for their loved ones to have their DNR order rescinded. Do not resuscitate, which simply typically means don't maybe put me on a ventilator if I stop breathing, don't restart my heart, don't give me CPR. It doesn't mean do not rescue.
But sorry for interrupting, Sheri, doesn't it even go to another level? Because at some point, because I know there was a trial that took place here, there was a doctor and I believe a couple of nurses who were accused of using medication to, in fact, accelerate the potential death of certain patients.
So that was the next ethical conundrum. So first you had Katrina hit on early Monday morning. Tuesday morning is when the floodwaters rose. That's when they realized we have to evacuate. Who do we pick first? Right. Wednesday morning, all power fails, like you said. And just imagine in our modern American hospitals, we saw this with Sandy. This is the thing. It's not just a one-time thing. In Sandy, we had hospitals that had electrical systems vulnerable to floodwaters. Floodwater rises, all the power goes out. What do you do? Everything runs on power, even medical records these days. So that's when the situation became
electronic, right?
Electronic medical records, exactly. So when the little laptops lost power, they didn't have access to that, let alone the pumps that pump the IV fluids in, let alone the ventilators, which they had battery backups, but only for a small period.
Patients suffering during this?
Well, everybody was suffering, yes. Well, patients weren't getting their normal medical care anymore. That's one thing. All medical care kind of breaks down. You don't have the tools. The medical staff was worried. They heard gunshots going off. It was very hot in New Orleans. So even before the power failed, when they were on backup power, their backup generators were not hooked up to the air conditioning system.
They were not ready for this at all.
Yeah, well, I think many hospitals aren't ready. That's the thing.
Even
is that
today.
we have vulnerabilities in our healthcare system.
They're not ready for it in terms of infrastructure. They're not ready for it in terms of disaster preparedness. But then they're not ready for it in terms of the ethical and moral decisions that are going to have to be made. They're not ready for it on any level.
And that's when this second question arose. So they had a number of pets in this hospital because people in New Orleans, if you're going to work a hurricane, sometimes the hospitals let you bring your pet. You don't have to leave your pet at home and decide, do I go to work or not? So the pets were in medical records. People said, we aren't even getting patients out quickly enough. Helicopters were coming, like you said, boats were coming for people, the family members, et cetera, were getting on those. Nobody was allowed to bring even a suitcase. So they said, we better euthanize the pets. So that started happening.
They killed the pets.
They killed the pets. They thought it was merciful. They thought at that moment they didn't have a chance to save them. It turned out somebody quick thinking, what really helps in a disaster is flexible thinking. Somebody remembered that there was a boat in the neighborhood on a trailer. They went out and hot-wired that boat and brought it back. Then they could start bringing out pets, but they didn't realize this at the time. So that Wednesday, you've got helicopters coming. They've got a whole city to rescue. People on their rooftops might not even have water. At least at this hospital, they had food and water. So then the helicopters slowed. These patients, like you said, were suffering like everyone else, weren't getting medical care. The sickest had been saved for last. They grew sicker. So a day later, that Thursday, that's when this question arose. We're putting the pets out of their misery. Should we be doing something about patients?
Did they use extra morphine or whatever to put some of these patients to death sooner than they otherwise would have died?
2 doctors told me, yes, we did this. They said, I did this.
They made that moral and ethical
here's
decision.
Why I did it. Yes.
Some might argue they played God.
Yeah. Well, like you said, the Attorney General, there was a year-long investigation, nearly a year-long investigation, ended up with the arrest of a nurse and 2 doctors who were very well regarded. The grand jury never indicted them. They insisted that they were innocent. So unlike the 2 doctors who spoke with me and said, yes, we injected these patients with the goal of hastening death. We felt it was the right thing to do. We were desperate. That doctor and 2 nurses said, no, we were just giving the medicines for comfort. 20 patients ended up dying in a short period of time.
Didn't 45 die overall?
Yes, there were 45 bodies recovered. About 40 died during and after that storm. Right. What the toxicology reports showed, and also they were keeping track of when people died. So between those 2, they found 20 patients had received those 2 drugs, one or the other or both, and died in a very short time period on that Thursday.
Let's do this. By the way, 5 Days at Memorial. Can we just plug? Well, you're good at plugging. 5 Days at Memorial is the book. Sheri Fink is the author. An extraordinary book. And for those who think, oh yeah, that happened in Katrina. So we must have gotten the message and the memo and fixed things since then. No. So many hospitals continue to not be prepared, to have built the infrastructure so that they can withstand and be ready for this, have the backup systems, all that. What would you say the takeaway message that you would want to, listen, these important details are important, right? But you want to offer a takeaway message to everyone, which is?
I absolutely do. So I think surviving one of these things without this catastrophic kind of result has to do with 3 things. One is infrastructure, and we've got major vulnerabilities. So are we going to invest the money to retrofit existing hospitals? It's very expensive. But if we don't, we need to have plans for how we're going to deal with that. Number 2 is the organizational level, and that means hospitals and nursing homes and all these medical facilities with inpatients have to think about what would we do? They have to plan. They have to face the worst case scenario.
You have to plan for a crisis.
Yeah.
And if not, you make the crisis worse. I'm sorry, I interrupted.
Yeah, have a leadership structure in place, have an evacuation plan in place.
Contingency plans.
And third is the personal level, which is think in advance as you as a person, whatever role we have in society, whatever you may live in a building with elderly people. We need to be able to make individual decisions that are good decisions in a crisis. That's very hard to do when you are hot, tired, scared, haven't slept. But if we think in advance, and that's part of why I wrote 5 Days at Memorial, part of why it focuses on individual decision making, is that I think we can perform better. And it's really about being flexible too. You have your plans, but the plans always have to change. It's like in the military.
That's what I mean by contingency plans.
Exactly.
Someone says, I have my plan on paper. You say?
Yeah, you practice it, drill with it, and then be prepared to change it.
Final question, 30 seconds. Biggest impact this has had on you personally? doing
Oh,
that,
wow.
writing that book?
Well, I spent 6 years really researching this topic, and I became really passionate about preparedness. And I think we need to face it more in this country. And yeah,
And you
that's
met a
what I
lot of
would
people
say.
you wound up caring about, I'm sure.
It's true. Yeah, yeah. All of the people who were trapped in this situation were compelling, and I ended up kind of caring about all of them: the doctors, the nurses, the patients, the family members.
It wasn't just writing for you, it was more than that. Sheri Fink is the author. 5 Days at Memorial is the book. Go out and get it. It's an important lesson for all of us. You can't just hope a crisis doesn't happen like this, a disaster. Thank you so much, Sheri.
Thanks.
Important work.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.
One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been a production of the Caucus Educational Corporation, celebrating 25 years of broadcast excellence in partnership with St. Joseph's Healthcare System. This special edition of One-on-One with Steve Adubato is brought to you from the Tisch WNET studios at Lincoln Center. Funding has been provided by Holy Name Medical Center in Teaneck, New Jersey, NJIT, New Jersey Natural Gas, MagnaCare, Sun National Bank, the New Jersey Education Association, and by the Russell Berry Foundation. Transportation provided by Airbrook Limousine, serving the metropolitan New York, New Jersey area. One-on-One with Steve Adubato has been made possible in part by activists and the American Medicine Chest Challenge.